Okay, it is 1:05 and we're going to get started. My name is Eugenie Jones-Loffridge. I'm DCD's Marketing Communications Program Coordinator, and welcome to the third in our series of Start Here webinars. We are going to be talking about critical areas today, but before we get started, I'd like to introduce our guest. I'm very happy to have with me as subject matter experts, Scott Diener. He is the manager of DCD Development Services and Engineering Division. Also with DSE, Steve Heacock, rather, one Scott, one Steve. Steve is a senior planner in DSE.
Hello, all.
And last but certainly not least, Angie Silva, DCD Assistant Director. Thank you, Angie, for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Eugenie, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
And I don't want to forget our marketing communications folks, also supporting Alicia Atler, our marketing communications tech, who's here helping with the facilitation of all of the things on the behind the scenes. So we're going to get this ball rolling. First, I'd like to take a moment to share my screen with you. So as I mentioned a moment ago, this is our third webinar in the Start Here series. This is a series of land use and building development basics outreach, and it's a combination of printed materials, website content, and webinars like the one we're in today. Start Here is an educational outreach that is targeting landowners, providing basic level educational resources to facilitate their success in their development projects, whether it be land use or building development. We want to see our residents be successful in those endeavors, and this project is meaning to help that happen. It's possible through a grant from the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's a social marketing education outreach project, and it's designed to proactively improve landowner development decisions and to mitigate negative impacts to land cover, stormwater, and our critical areas. So this project is not just a shot in the dark. We actually did a great deal of research to inform our decisions about how to put this project together. We began with data mining, looking at previous DCD permit service clients to see what their experiences have been. We interviewed, we sent surveys out community-wide, and we also had small group focus groups to interview collectively one-on-one with folks to get their input and insight, and also did DCD as subject matter expert interviews. All of that research to bring us to this conclusion that in order for us to be more effective in our efforts, that we needed to reach permit applicants with information and materials before they apply for their permits. We're doing this because we want to increase awareness, we want to improve site design, we want to reduce missteps, and we also want to protect our natural resources. So maybe this is your first webinar, but there have been others prior to this. This and the previous ones will be recorded and left on the DCD website for access into the future. And these other webinars are coming up as well. And you can find all of this, previous and future, on our website, and you're able to register online and also view the previous webinars. Well, Alicia will put this website address into the chat window so that you can have it, copy it and paste it and save it for your future use. As I said, today's topic is critical areas. We want to be able to share information that gives insight into these questions. What are they? Do I have critical areas on my property? And if I do, what do I need to do? So we're going to toss the ball into Scott's court, and Scott is going to begin by talking about defining critical areas. Scott?
Scott, you're muted.
Scott, you're on mute.
Not anymore. Thank you,
Okay.
Eugenie. We will talk today about what kinds of critical areas there are in more detail, beginning with the next slides. But essentially, critical areas are natural systems, both large and small, that provide an ecological value to the property by virtue of a unique set of functions or which must be considered due to the sensitivity of features on the land, or is considered a resource of value. It's noteworthy, I think, for many people that the Growth Management Act requires GMA counties to plan for and protect its critical areas. In our case, under Kitsap County Code, Title 19, Critical Areas Ordinance. When considering the level of protection that codes must provide, we are required to use best available science in our decision-making to update the Critical Areas Ordinance regularly. The definition of critical areas in Kitsap County Code 19.150.215 reads, critical areas means those areas and ecosystems identified as wetlands, areas with a critical recharging effect on aquifers, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, geologically hazardous areas, and frequently flooded areas. For our discussion today, we've added streams since they have important development considerations as well. I'll review these critical area types, but they'll be reviewed again individually on subsequent slides. Most people are familiar with wetlands, but wetlands are areas that are typically inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater and may be large or small. They're not always evident except by soil typology, may be connected by a mosaic, and may be standalone. Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, estuaries, bogs, and ponds. Fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas are areas that serve a critical role in sustaining needed habitats and species for the functional integrity of the ecosystem, and which, if altered, may reduce the likelihood that the species will persist over the long term. Geologically hazardous areas, and we have a lot in the county, means areas that, because of their susceptibility to erosion, sliding, or earthquake, or other geological events, are not suitable for development. Frequently flooded areas are lands in the floodplain subject to a chance of flooding in any given year, or with an area subject to flooding due to high groundwater. These areas can include streams, lakes, coastal areas, and wetlands. Generally, floodplains are designated on maps by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or what we know as FEMA. And while floodplains are noted in the definition of critical areas, it is addressed by FEMA and Kitsap County Code Title 15, frequently flooded areas. Critical aquifer recharge areas means those areas with a critical recharging effect on aquifers used for potable water. It's essentially our groundwater. Finally, streams means those areas where the surface water flows are sufficient to produce a defined channel or bed and need not contain water year-round. The Critical Areas Ordinance emphasizes a calculated approach to development, including avoiding impacts, so considering alternatives or alternative locations to the development. Also minimizing impacts that cannot be avoided, so considering methods, techniques, or alternatives that will be less stressful to the critical areas. Mitigating impact that may occur to critical areas on site, so providing some sort of mitigation that is preferable to the overall health of the ecosystem. And all of this done while keeping in mind the public health, safety, and welfare. DCD's role is one of providing oversight, ensuring that the county code is followed. And while DCD ensures that critical areas are considered and addressed as needed during development, there's often other agency or governmental oversight or involvement. For example, the Department of Ecology and tribal governments have a role in monitoring critical areas. And it's a complex process that we must be very careful with and very mindful of.
Thank you, Scott. Steve, going to pass the mic to you to discuss buffers.
Very good. Thank you, Eugenie. Well, buffers are areas adjacent to critical areas, which are essentially restricted from specific development activities. Buffers are meant to be non-impacted by a development proposal in a natural state, or they can be enhanced as well. and they vary dependent on the critical area and their categories or types. So in wetland buffers, we establish wetland buffers in a corridor protection around the land feature itself. And again, they may not be disturbed. And if there is disturbance, that disturbance must be mitigated. And finally, they cannot experience a loss of ecological function. And then wetland buffer sizes are dependent and determined by the wetland category. We have categories from 1 through 4 for wetlands. It's also dependent on the land use intensity. So for instance, a commercial development may be more impactful than a residential development, or forestry for that matter too. So those intensities depend on the review by the wetland consultant itself. And then the functions of wetlands include habitat, water quality, and also soils. So soil types, a bog, for instance, is a more sensitive type of environment than, say, a emergent wetland in a field. And then again, wetland qualifiers, soil type, what we call hydric soils, are necessary for the formation of a wetland and the categorization of a wetland. The soils must also be saturated during some portion of the season. And wetlands can be man-made. Typically, they're naturally occurring, but they can also include man-made features. And then finally, with the wetland situation, the wetland plants have to be present in the wetland as well. Those 3 qualifiers are what make up a wetland itself. And now on to fish and wildlife conservation areas. They are identified as involving priority species and habitats. They're not always fish. They can be fowl. They can also be amphibians, for instance, the western pond turtle. And then they can also, again, be a fish type as well. But they're not specific to just fish alone. When we're identifying riparian habitats and flowing rivers and streams, though it is typically fish type, we do have a number of endangered or threatened salmonid species in Kitsap County. Development in a fish and wildlife conservation area may often be managed or mitigated through implementation of a habitat management plan, and the onus is on the applicant to provide that report to Department of Community Development through a qualified biologist. And in riparian habitat itself is found along flowing waters, rivers, streams, and creeks, and also small lakes. And they may also be regulated under the Shoreline Master Program. I think I mentioned they apply to streams, lakes, and wetlands themselves. And we have, as Scott had mentioned, there are numerous geological hazardous areas in Kitsap County. Typically, they're steep slopes, but not necessarily very steep. We have erosion hazards in slopes that are as minor as 15%. So that's not very steep of a slope. We also have landslide hazard areas for steeper slopes along some of our shorelines. and along riparian corridors as well. So those landslide areas can be superficial slides, or they could be more deep-seated slides that are way more serious. And then, of course, then seismic hazard areas. We do have the Seattle Fault that runs through essentially the center of the county. And the seismic hazard areas can also be located on flatter ground that's saturated, and we can have a liquefaction potential, and we can discuss that later. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Angie, your turn to talk about critical aquifer charges.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Eugenie and Mr. Heacock. So as Scott mentioned before, one of the other critical areas as regulated by the Washington State Growth Management Act, as well as what needs to be incorporated in our local critical areas ordinances, are critical aquifer recharge areas, or what we call CARAs for short. So essentially, as everyone knows here, potable water is essential to all life. And a majority of Kitsap County drinking water comes from groundwater supplies in aquifers themselves. And these areas, as regulated in our CAO, have a recharging effect on those aquifers to provide water to not only folks that live here today, but future generations. And our CAO oversees development standards and types of uses that may be vulnerable to contamination or reduce that recharge value. And what mentioned before, kind of the overview of frequently flooded areas, and as Scott mentioned, through FEMA, so again, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and through their National Flood Insurance Program, through that federal agency and then administered through the Washington State Department of Ecology, we also have development regulations that we must implement for these frequently flooded areas. And what this essentially does is oversee development proposed in these areas that must take into consideration flood hazards into that overall development of proposal, as well as ultimate approval of that. And while boots on the ground does not replace mapping or anything of that nature, we do have a series of informational maps available to anyone here or around the world to take a look at the various mapped critical areas. And again, just taking a look at the participants here today, there's a lot of seasoned veterans as well as knowledgeable folks about critical areas, and can provide a lot of great on the ground site specific awareness of where those critical area features are and are not. And last but not least, again, never replacing boots on the ground assessment. There's several resources that provide and assist on feasibility reviews for critical areas, whether that's the critical area maps I mentioned before, but also if you want to know a little bit more about the requirements of a critical areas ordinance under the Washington State Growth Management Act, we have several links here that will be available to anybody listening to this webinar or checking out our Start Here website. But also the Federal Emergency Management Agency does have great flood maps available that go in further depth beyond our local mapping, as well as the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife provide great mapping resources when it comes to priority habitats and species overview. As well as Mr. Heacock mentioned, some of these projects not only may have local permitting needs, there may be some state or even federal permit requirements. So please take a look at the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife Hydrologic Project Approval Permit website linked here. But also, please feel free to take a look at the Shoreline Master Program project website that was just recently locally adopted by our Kitsap County Board of County Commissioners. And as we wait for the Washington State Department of Ecology to take final action on that before becoming effective.
Thank you, Angie. And Alicia will provide all of these links into the chat window for everyone. So should you want to access them, you will be able to do so and be able to utilize these resources. I want to just plug again, Angie mentioned the Start Here website that is available on DCD's website, and it allows you to access the previous webinars that we've had, register for future webinars, And also there's an opportunity for industry representatives to get involved in the Start Here process as communication ambassadors. And what that means is that you are sharing on your website a link that draws your clients back to the educational resources at DCD so that they can access those webinars and brochures and content and be better prepared to handle their projects. And reciprocally, we will list you on our website as a communication ambassador, making people aware that you are an industry rep in the business, in our community, and that you are helping us get the educational information out there to our community. So with that being said, thank you all very much. That was really quick. It's time to go, right? No. No, it's not time to go. We are going to take questions. So are you all able to see the questions? So our participants, there are 55 of you listed there. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A window, and our subject matter experts here, Scott, Steve, and Angie, will be able to help and answer them. Scott?
All right, I'll take the first one. So how do you determine the critical situation on erosion and landslides? So I think the question is asking if you think you might have critical areas in the form of slopes that might contribute to erosions or slide potential, what should you do? The answer is, well, this says Angie would like to answer the, okay.
I'm just helping facilitate the Q&A, so please feel free to respond, Mr. Diener.
Okay, so in that situation, it would be advisable to hire a geotechnical analyst, as somebody who has experience in understanding the geotechnical aspects of the land features you're talking about. If they are not as extreme as they might appear on paper, quite often a geotechnical letter will suffice for the review, where the geotechnical consultant says they have no concerns with the proposed development. However, other times it may be required that there is a geotechnical report, which is a much deeper dive and a more expensive dive into requirements that might be needed to provide for safe development.
Thank you, Scott. Steve? You're on mute. We're not that good at lip reading, but go ahead.
There we go. How about that?
That's better.
We have an anonymous attendee asking about seasonal springs and whether or not their creeks are considered riparian areas. It really depends on if the seasonal spring is a seep line, which we often get in the shoreline. Obviously, those seep lines on steep slopes are part of what we would review in a geotechnical aspect or a geotechnical way. But if there's a spring that's in a defined channel, the defined channel, the differentiation between whether that's a spring or considered a riparian area is really dependent on if there's a gravel substrate. So those areas that have a gravel substrate are really deemed a creek. And that's the differentiation. And I hope that answered that question.
Thank you, Steve.
Mr. Diener, we have a great question from someone in attendance today. What kind of certification should we look for with regards to a biologist for a habitat management plan? Do we have a list of recommended partners we could share?
We do have a list of firms that have submitted work to Kitsap County, and Eugenie, I don't know if we can find that link and provide that.
Yeah, so Alicia can provide that link. She's the one who built that page.
Okay.
It was posted in January, I believe, and it's not only geologists, but other industry experts, all who have been involved in permit application over the past year at DCD. And we basically pulled those folks' names and listed them. So Alicia will share that link so that you can access that. We're in a precarious situation where we can share that information with you, but we can't make recommendations about particular services in the community. So we can point you in the right direction and let you make that choice.
And thank you for those clarifications. It's also worth, and I might need some help from Steve here, but it's also worth noting that there is no prescriptive requirement for certification that the county requires in its applications and analysis. There are various certifications, including by geo experts, is what I'll call them, that could be considered hydrogeologists, geotechnical, and more that Steve is more familiar with. Steve, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'd add in relation to the difference between a licensed geologist that may just address erosion hazard or recommendations for buffers on slopes, that type of thing, versus a geotechnical engineer. And a geotechnical engineer is a professional engineer that also has training specific to slope stability. And so those two there's a differentiation between those two skill sets. A geotechnical engineer is much better, has much more training. They deal specifically with water transmission and make recommendations for stormwater controls and that type of thing on a property too. So if you have a very steep property, you'll probably need to get a geotechnical engineer versus a geologist. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Scott, is there another question on the board that you'd like to take?
Sure. Himalayan blackberry removal over a stream. My understanding, and I'll take any corrections I can get, is that removal of invasive species is not does not require a permit application from DCD.
I'd further on that if there's invasive vegetation that's actually in a creek, you're going to need to discuss that with State Fish and Wildlife, because they may have a permit requirement for it, depending on the disturbance. If the creek has the presence of fish, that type of thing, they may have timing limitations for that. But typically what we'd like people to do is, if they have that kind of situation and have invasive species in a critical area, and you're aware of it, especially on a slope, or within a wetland buffer or stream buffer, to go ahead and give us a call so that at least we're aware of it. And then we'll be happy to take a look at that and give you some advice of whether or not we feel you need to outreach to other agencies. But also it keeps the applicant from getting calls as well. You have this happen all the time where somebody will go in and think, oh, I can just do some stream maintenance or things like that, and end up in trouble. So we want to avoid that at all costs. So
thank you, Steve and Scott, on that one.
Yeah,
Angie, she would take one.
Sure. There's a great question here. Is a geotech study completed 23 years ago, done by a qualified geologist, still valid today? And like most things related to our natural environment, things change, ground moves, etc. So we typically employ, like many of our special reports, a 5-year duration to those assessments. So given it's over a couple decades long, we would probably want some new eyes on the ground, see if those grounds are moving. Is the conditions the same? Now, whether it's a full-blown report or if it's kind of an addendum to that report, we'll definitely need to look at that depending on how much may have changed on that site-specific circumstance.
Great answer.
It can also, I'd say also with that, you're spot on to Angie, as well, is that Geotech still in the business? From
That's a good point. That's a good point.
make sure that they're still in operation and still in business.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know, that sounds like a good title for another webinar, Dirt Moves. I think I'm gonna write that.
And also
I'm
the
gonna write that
requirements
down.
change too. Our critical areas ordinance in 1998 is vastly different to the one that was adopted in 2017.
Yes,
So that
it is.
needs to take into consideration new requirements in today's realities.
Nice. Scott?
Yeah, I'll take the next one. CARA, or critical aquifer recharge areas, are addressed in detail in Title 19, specifically Title 19, Section 600. You'll find in that part of the code that there are two types of critical aquifer recharge areas, and each one of those has their limitations. And I think there was a subsequent question that says, how can we determine our critical areas? And the part of the answer there also is that CARAs can be found on our parcel search map layers. If you go to our parcel search and look at the various themes and map layers, you will find that there is a lot of information, critical areas, shoreline designation, water bodies, critical aquifer recharge area. I'm trying to remember them all. I think I'm forgetting one. But a lot of those, a lot of that information is available on parcel search.
Thank you, Scott.
So
Steve?
here's a
Oh.
question, Mr. Heacock, about kind of hydrology and the changes over time. So a great question. So that means when rivers change and they are used as a boundary line, then an owner can lose or gain property by that, or one loses and gains property by the movement of river.
Well, I would say that if somebody has a property line demarked from a previous stream, that doesn't really necessarily change where that property line is. It may change the usable area of the property, but typically if something is surveyed in with a squiggly line from an old stream, that is the property line. It's identified in your parcel description as your property. But that migrating stream, the channel migration zone, is very common to happen in many of our creeks. And they can also be, if they're associated with a stream, we can have incised channels that end up causing landslides as well. So that can make your property even less usable and critical to, future development. You may have to, get a geotech report associated with a slope concern, and also the stream buffer situation as well. They're kind of additive. And when we have these incised channels with cut banks where the stream is actually cutting into the slope, we had a previous slide that Eugenie had provided of the Oso landslide, and that's precisely the kind of landslide that can occur when a channel is incised like that and undercuts. So it's a very critical kind of review. For the property line to answer that is specific to what's surveyed in.
And I'll add, Steve, that if there is a dispute about that property line, that's a civil matter, that's a private matter. It's not one that the county would be involved in.
Right.
Thank you both. I see a participant had a hand raised. If you would please, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A window and we can address it that way. Any other questions on the board, Angie, that you'd like to take?
I don't see any new questions we haven't responded to. So please feel free to send them in, everyone who's listening in. We're happy to respond to as many as we can.
Nice.
And I thought of something that I find really helpful in Kitsap County, especially some areas of the county that are more remote are not mapped very well for critical areas. So just because you don't think you have a critical area on your property doesn't necessarily mean that's not there. But there are some cues and clues that I'd like to relay to people, especially in using parcel search. And one of those is to take a look at the older aerial photos, and you'll be able to see in what's called the imagery view. There's a few maps that are very beneficial to identify whether something, say if you're looking for a piece of property, I like to cue people to look at the 2012 aerial, and it's a winter aerial. It's very unusual. And it's from 2012, so it's relatively recent, but you'll be able to see it because the winter view, the leaves are down. So you'll be able to see all the way down to the ground, and you'll see, oh gosh, maybe there's some standing water. You'll be able to see it on the aerial. And it's really beneficial for folks to take a look at that aerial layer when you're thinking about buying property, or if you're thinking about permits as well. Let's say, for instance, you never thought, gee, I don't think I have wetlands on my property, or a creek, you know, or an unmapped creek or something like that. But it can be apparent, and it is what we reviewers take a look at as well. Just a helpful hint.
Thank you, Steve. That is a helpful hint.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to take a deeper dive, Alicia, do we have additional information that folks can access to learn more about critical areas?
Yeah, we will actually have the brochure available in the next couple of days on that Start Here website that I put into the chat window. I can copy that again. It's also where the video for this webinar will be available again in the next couple of days.
Great. So if you want to have a hard copy, you can go there and download and print that out. Or if you just want to flip through the pages, it's online and available to you. We're in the process of rebuilding, updating, and making our brochures bright and cheerful for your use going forward. So we've updated this brochure and a few others, and we'll continue to add to that library case that you see on the Start Here website page. I want to again thank Scott Diener, Steve Heacock, and Angie Silva for their expertise in answering these questions. We could not have done this without you, and we greatly appreciate you. Alicia, thank you for all the work that you've done in the backdrop for the brochure and for this presentation. And I again am, oh, Veronica's hiding, but she's there too. Veronica Basson, our Permit Services Supervisor. She has been helping us behind the scenes, and we thank and appreciate her as well. My name is Eugenie Jones-Loffridge. I'm DCD Marketing Communications Program Coordinator, also Project Manager of the Start Here project, inviting you to come online and visit DCD and find and access the resources that we've generated with you in mind, helping you to be successful in your land use and building development projects. Thank you so much for being here.